Hi guys. We are finishing up finding Gobi today. So I'll split this into two videos. The chapters are pretty short. So I'm going to read chapter 20 and 21 here and then 22 and 23 um, in the next video. So chapter 20. So the men in suits just came and knocked on the door and he kind of pretended that they weren't there. So we're hopefully find out who they were. Chapter 20. Dion wanted to just take Gobi straight to Beijing and get out of Urumqi completely, but they still needed to see the vet and get medical approval. Once they had that, Kiki could get Gobi permission to fly. With any luck, they would be here only a few more days. Fortunately, Lu Xin was able to find Dion and Gobi an apartment that same day. Dion managed to get Gobi out of the hotel without a problem. He simply took her down to the parking lot one last time and handed her over to Lu Xin. Then he went back upstairs, checked out, and left through the front. Lu Xin and Gobi were waiting in Lu Xin's car outside. They drove to the new apartment. It wasn't fancy at all, but it was clean. There were plenty of shops and restaurants nearby, and the streets were busy but not too crowded. It was perfect. After Lu Xin left, Dion locked the door. Then he glanced down at Gobi. "It's quite the adventure we got ourselves into, isn't it, Gobi?" he said as he ruffled her fur. Gobi looked up at the tall man. This new place smelled a little like cleaners. It was okay, though. She had liked the room they had just left, but she hadn't liked being cooped up all the time. This place had more windows and more air. It had a couch and a bed and a table. But more important, it had her person. As long as he was with her, she was fine. She stared up at him for a second. Then she sniffed his feet. Next, she trotted over to the couch. Jumping up on it, she turned around a few times to make it more comfortable. Satisfied, she flopped down and curled up to take a nap. As far as she was concerned, this place was fine. The next day didn't go as smoothly, though. Dion had finally gotten an appointment to take Gobi to the vet. The man was supposed to be one of the top guys in the city, but he was very rough with Gobi. She squealed with pain when he pulled on her injured leg. Afterward, the vet told Dion that her hip was displaced and her femur had been bent away from the socket. She would need surgery to correct that, he said. But Dion wasn't about to let that man touch her again. After a short nap back in the apartment, Gobi seemed recovered from the trauma of the vet. Dion took her outside for a walk. They could both use some fresh air, he thought. It was a beautiful day. Several people stopped them for pictures. Thanks to all the interviews, everyone seemed to know who Dion and Gobi were. Gobi was happy to meet new people and sat patiently for each picture. Dion didn't mind either. It was nice to make people smile. But at one point, Dion looked around and saw a familiar car parked nearby. It was the gray sedan from the hotel parking lot. He could make out the two men in dark suits sitting inside. He knew that couldn't be a coincidence. They must have followed him here from the hotel. How long had they been watching him and Gobi? Who were they exactly, and what did they want? Part of him wanted to march right over and demand answers. But what if they were here to hurt him or Gobi? There were two of them, and Dion wasn't a fighter. Instead, he turned and headed back toward the apartment. There wasn't any point in running or in pretending he was going somewhere else. It was clear the men knew exactly where he lived. Gobi didn't complain that their walk had been cut short. She just trotted along beside Dion, the same as always. If she picked up on his fear, she didn't show it. As Dion was closing the apartment door behind him, the phone rang. He jumped. Was it the men from the gray sedan? He considered letting it ring, but decided to take a chance and answer it. "Hello," he said. "Dion," a man said on the other end. "It's Wendy." It took Dion a minute to realize who she was. Then he remembered. Wendy was an international freelance journalist living in Hong Kong who had contacted Lu Xin. They had spoken once or twice. "Hey," Dion said finally. "Hi." "Are you okay?" Wendy asked. "You sound odd." "Yeah, no, maybe," Dion replied. "There are these guys following me." He told Wendy about the men in the dark suits. "That's actually why I'm calling," Wendy said. "It's not just the guys in the car." She didn't sound surprised at all. "You've got some pretty big people watching this, Dion." Dion frowned. "What do you mean?" he asked. He was still trying to figure out why Wendy didn't sound more concerned. "Just that," Wendy answered. "You've got to be careful what you say." She lowered her voice like she didn't want anyone to overhear. "I've spoken to some colleagues and they've heard there are some local government advisors who are watching the story and listening to everything you say. You've got to make sure that anything you say about China is said in a positive way," Wendy warned. Dion sat down on the couch. He closed his eyes and tried to wrap his head around what Wendy had said. "You've talked to people about this?" he asked after a second. "You mean that someone's told you this?" "Don't worry about how, Dion. I just wanted to make sure you got the message." Dion understood. Dion's thoughts went back to the men in the dark suits. So you think these guys in the suits are from the state, he asked. Well, they're not there to steal Gobi, are they? Wendy pointed out. No, Dion realized they weren't. If they had been after Gobi, they could have done it any time. They could also have done a better job at hiding, he thought. They're here for my protection, he wondered aloud. Kind of, Wendy agreed. As long as you can do the right thing, you'll be fine. Just don't talk to CNN again. CNN? Dion glanced up. How do you know about CNN? He had actually had one interview with them already. They had asked him to do a second one, and he had been trying to arrange a time for that. Wendy didn't explain. She only said, There's bad blood between CNN and the state. Just steer clear, okay? Dion promised he'd be careful. He even remembered to thank Wendy for the warning. Then he hung up and sat there, stunned. Was this his life now, he thought? It was more like a bad spy movie. Men following him, other men threatening him, plots to scan money from him. How had all of this happened? But Wendy hadn't sounded panicked. She had told Dion everything would be all right. She also said that Dion was doing fine so far. That was a good thing. Dion did cancel his plans for a second CNN interview. And just to be sure, he turned down several other requests for overseas interviews. He even told Lu Xin that he didn't want to talk to any Chinese media either. It was better to play it safe, he decided. He didn't want to risk saying the wrong thing to the wrong person and losing Gobi forever. She had been sitting beside him throughout the phone calls. Now she whined and licked his face. Then she hopped into his lap and curled up there. Don't worry, Dion assured the little dog softly as he petted her. Yes, it's all a bit nuts, but you're worth it. Chapter 21. Dion and Gobi spent several more days in the apartment. They didn't see the men in the dark suits again, though Dion guessed they were probably still watching from somewhere nearby. But Dion had decided not to let fear stop him and Gobi from enjoying themselves as much as they could. They took long walks, they played and napped, and Dion even made friends with some of the locals when he stepped out one night to get some food. But finally they were ready to go. Kiki had worked her magic and they were flying to Beijing the next day. Dion was glad Kiki was there, especially when they headed to the airport. Gobi already didn't look very happy about being stuck inside a crate. Dion hated to think how she'd look after a 3-hour flight spent in the cargo hold. We don't have a choice, Kiki explained to Dion. There's simply no way Gobi can fly in the cabin with you. Dion knew this was true. Here in China, they were oddly suspicious of dogs. Some people had even crossed the street when they'd seen them out walking Gobi. Kiki was right. They would never let Gobi fly with him. Take care down there, Dion told Gobi as he settled her into the crate. He added an old t-shirt so she would have something that smelled like him, and she had food and water and a cushion to lie on. All in all, it was a nice, cozy little space. The question was, how would Gobi do with altitudes, especially when that mixed with speed and cold? There was nothing else Dion could do, though. To get back home, they would have to fly from either Shanghai or Beijing, and that meant flying to one of those two cities first. Besides, he decided that it was better to know beforehand how Gobi would handle being on a plane. This way, if there were any problems, he and Kiki could figure out ways to help Gobi handle traveling better when it was time to finally leave China. Gobi whined and whimpered. She did not like this at all. The crate itself was not so bad. She was used to being able to roam at will, but at least there was enough room to turn around in here. And it had a comfy bed and food and water, and the tall man, her person, had put one of his shirts in here so it even smelled like him. But she did not like being in this busy, noisy, smelly, crowded place. There were just too many people, and she couldn't run and hide. True, she had the crate to protect her, but what if they got in somehow? She would have nowhere to go. Then some men put her in a crate on a strange shelf that moved, and it carried her away. The tall man and the nice lady disappeared, and everything was dark. That passed eventually, and Gobi found herself in a large, noisy room that smelled of metal. All the people here were rushing around, and some of them grabbed her crate and moved it into a covered cart. That drove out onto a big open space, and Gobi barked when she saw the sky again. Maybe the journey was over? If so, it had not been nearly as bad as she thought. But no, instead of taking her back to her person, or even releasing her, the men drove the cart over to a big metal box sitting out in the open. Then they loaded her crate and a bunch of other boxes and bags into the bottom of the box. It was dark in here, and chilly, and Gobi barked and barked. All the men did was secure her crate with some straps and then leave her there. She was all alone. And it got worse. After a little while, the box shook and made loud clanking noises. Then there was a steady, almost deafening roar. And then the whole box started moving. Gobi could tell it was moving fast, too. Faster than she could run, maybe faster than a car. Then there was a strange floating sensation and the world tilted. She fell down but fortunately landed on her bed. Some of her water and her food spilled, though. When they finally righted again, it was so cold. Gobi could see her breath every time she gasped. She barked, but nobody came, and finally she gave up and hunkered down on her bed with a whimper. This was horrible. She finally fell asleep, but it wasn't restful. She kept tossing and turning. When would this nightmare be over? Sadly, Gobi turned out not to like flying, at least not in the cargo hold. By the time Dion was able to retrieve her crate after the flight, the inside of the crate looked like though it had been through a blender. The water bottle had been smashed, the lease had been chewed through, the food was scattered everywhere, and Gobi was snapping and shivering and staring wide eyed all around her. That was probably her first flight ever, Dion realized as he spotted Kiki by the door and waved. She returned the gesture and motioned for them to join her. Good flight? Kiki asked as soon as they were all together. She glanced in Gobi's pen and sighed. No, I can see at least one of you didn't enjoy the flight at all. She led the way toward the parking garage where she also left her truck. Well, you're here now. You made it. As soon as they were in the truck, Dion released the catches on the crate door. Gobi leaped into his arms and he held her and pet her until her shivering stopped. You're okay, he promised her over and over again. You made it. It's all right. But of course he knew this was really just the beginning of their journey. I've got a space all set up for her, Kiki promised as she drove out of the airport parking lot and onto the streets of Beijing. She'll be comfy, I promise. And I'll be here in Beijing the whole time. I'll stop by to see her every day, even if I'm not in the office that day. Gobi had to spend the next month here in Beijing while they got her another round of medical approvals and waited for permission to take her out of the country completely. She would be staying at Kiki's kennel, and Dion knew she would take good care of Gobi. He smiled as Kiki reached over and ruffled the little dog's fur. It was obvious that Kiki loved animals and clear that she already liked Gobi in particular. And Gobi liked her too. The little dog licked her hand, which made Kiki laugh. They would be fine together, he was sure. That didn't make leaving the next day any easier, though. It broke Dion's heart when he said goodbye to Gobi. She obviously knew something was up because she whimpered and whined and pressed against his leg as if she were urging him not to go. I'll be back, I promise, he told her, scooping her up into a final hug. You'll stay with Kiki for a month, and I'll come get you again and we'll head home. Except that they wouldn't be able to go straight home, he knew. He would come back so he could fly Gobi to London, but then she would have to spend the next 4 months in quarantine in Heathrow. He didn't want to think about that right now, though. They had made it to Beijing, which was the first step. He just had to focus on that. Dion tried not to look back as he headed for the door, and he tried not to hear Gobi whimpering behind him. It was the same noise she made that day of the race when they had reached the river and he had started across without her. But this time he knew he couldn't turn around and go get her. It just didn't work that way. I'll see you in a month, he told her instead. Then he hurried out the door, trying not to cry. Go listen to the other video.